Hello and welcome to Meet the Music. I'm your host, Thomas Corley. This episode features one of the few genres in our series, The Many Sounds of the Caribbean, here in our third season. This episode's genre is Calypso. Our guest this episode is probably our second guest, whose book is actually probably a textbook. You have to check it out if you want to follow the journey of the genre. It's now printed in paperback and available as an ebook. Our guest this episode is Dr. Timothy Dodge, or Dr. HepCat. Give me a second and I'll elaborate on Dr. HepCat's name. Dr. Dodge is a preference librarian at Auburn University. Go Tigers. Now, Dr. HepCat is a radio DJ who broadcasts the Golden Oldies on WEGL Auburn FM 91.1 or WGLFM.com. By the way, he's our second radio DJ featured on Meet the Music. Dr. Dodge is also an author. His book, Rhythm and Blues Goes Calypso, is a spark for our conversation. He also has a previous book titled The School of Arizona Drains. Is that pronounced correct? Yep. Gospel Music Pioneer. Dr. Dodge, welcome to Meet the Music.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm honored to be here.
So of all the stuff that you play on the radio, how did you get from today's classic rock music format from the 50s, 60s? How did you get all the way over to Calypso? Well, how did it get into your headspace?
Oh, well, it started out basically in childhood in some ways. I'll kind of give you a breakdown. It was about 1964, 65. I was in second grade, so I would have been about 7, 8 years old. I'm 64. So in any case, you may recall, at least many elementary schools, there was a music class where kids would be singing at the direction of the teacher. And one of the songs was the one that's associated with Harry Belafonte, Day-O, daylight come and me one go home. Well, that was the beginning of it all. After that, second grade, of course, ended for me in 1965. But, Calypso stayed vaguely on my mind. But what really got me focused truly was when I moved to Miami. It was 1984, so I was definitely a mature adult. I was almost 27 years old actually at the time. I had a job lined up at Barry University Library, and I knew that what little I started exploring Miami. I said, "Wow, fascinating cultures here. There's West Indians, there's Latin Americans, So, any case, I said, there's got to be Calypso music available here somewhere." Well, long story short is I found eventually an FM radio station. It was hosted by a man named Arnold Trinidad Henry, who called himself the Beauty on Duty.
Okay.
And he hosted a wonderful program, but it turned out to be Calypso had changed into something that I wasn't aware of until 1984. It's called soca, S-O-C-A. That's the modern party dance-oriented form of Calypso, but it is definitely a form of Calypso. So I was intrigued, and I very much enjoyed the then current form of Calypso. And obviously, soca is still going on nowadays in the 2020s, though it in turn has changed quite a bit as well. But I was saying to myself, well, okay, what I'm hearing on radio is fascinating, fun, and I really like it. But what's happened between Harry Belafonte and now, now being 1984? So, I am a kind of a semi-fanatic record collector. I'd started collecting records about 1970, primarily at first rock and roll rhythm and blues of the 50s. But in any case, I expanded my collecting activities, and eventually I was able to find through music catalogs, as well as in those days we still had record stores and CD stores where you could go in person. And I started rummaging around and finding, now this is where there's some Calypso music here. There's, it's everything from steel band music, the instrumental stuff to vocals going back actually as far back as the 19-teens. Ultimately, is as far back as recorded Calypso will go. So that kind of really solidified it for me. And I've had actually a total of 4 radio shows I've hosted, and in those years, I was in Miami, 1984 through 87, about 3.5 years. And I ended up on a little nonprofit FM station, WDNA. I was actually the host of a blues and also a gospel program. I substituted as a sub on the gospel program. But in any case, I mentioned just this because when I left Miami, I very quickly, I don't want to get too autobiographical here and long, but I went to the University of New Hampshire um, to work on a PhD in history, but also to get a job in the special collections department at their library, the university library. And I also had a chance then to get on WUNH, the radio station. And that's where I said, okay. At first, they didn't have room for me. They eventually got me onto their oldies program, which is what I really wanted. But in the meantime, I'd established on Saturday mornings, very early Saturday mornings, the Calypso Carnival radio program. And so I was hosting Calypso music really from the 19 teens up through soca of the 1980s, late 80s at that point. So that's kind of
That's
where
really,
Calypso
really
got to
cool.
me.
That is so
Thank you.
cool. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now, my listeners will probably get tired of me talking about so many different things because I always bring up on the same show. But I heard in there, and part of your breakdown, that you are a vinyl collector, nerd, connoisseur,
Yes.
or whatever. So
Oh,
in that
yes.
in that process, when you ventured off, did you start with the liner notes?
Oh, yeah, yeah. I still, believe me, I still read those because I still collect both records and CDs.
Yeah.
So yeah. Oh, I rely on those. Sometimes they're not maybe always that accurate. It turns out in the long run, but a lot of times some of that's about the only place you can find some of this information because yes, there are books such as in fact the book that I recently worked on that you spoke about, and in fact I now have a new book contract for another book about music history. I can mention that later on if you're interested. But um, that you know, some of that is very hard to track down. It may sometimes only be, say, an interview sometimes with an artist that musical artist that has not been published anywhere, even in some cases. So yes, those liner notes, they are sometimes truly invaluable.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So let's start with the history of Calypso. I mean, let's give that our listener who's sitting out there who's familiar with jazz and classical music and pop, but is unfamiliar with anything from the Caribbean.
Okay. It's really quite an interesting and complex story, which I'll try to make reasonably understandable, shall we say? But be aware that Trinidad and Tobago, by the way, is the country that claims the origins of calypso. I just say claims because I think they are accurate with the claim, but there are other English speaking parts of the Caribbean that like to think that they may be the ones who really came up with calypso first. But all the indications are that really Trinidad and Tobago, TNT for short, is where it started. But of course, ultimately, really, the origins in large part are from West Africa. As we all know that slavery was ongoing, and that Trinidad. Long story short, was obviously the first settlers really were the Arawak and Carib Indians, but the first non-Indian settlers were the Spanish, and they did have a few slaves with them, African slaves with them, but essentially Trinidad was not well developed economically, shall we say, and so again trying to keep the details to a minimum. But I will mention that in the late 18th century, that a number of French planters, from nearby islands that were owned by the French in the Caribbean, such as Grenada, St. Lucia, Martinique, and a few others, that they saw an opportunity to develop what was then still largely very undeveloped territory in terms of agriculture, sugar plantations in particular, although there were other crops as well, coconut palms and things. So long story short, they got the okay from the Spanish king as long as they basically agreed to become Spanish subjects, and they agreed that they were going to remain Roman Catholics, not become Protestants or anything. I just mentioned the religion aspect because that will tie in just a second. So in any case, I can't give you exact numbers, but it probably was, at least at first, a few hundred French plantation owners, settlers coming from the nearby islands with their African slaves. And they brought the beginnings of the music of what became known as Calypso. I say this because, yes, the African connections are crucial. But what is going to be ultimately blended in is some of at first, a little bit of Spanish, but mainly French linguistic, connections, as well as some of the musical connections a little bit too. And Calypso started out, the music started out basically more or less recognizable by the late 18th century as a music that was partly it was extemporaneous. That means improvised, on the spot. You would make lyrics that sometimes were quite pointed, actually, in in terms of social commentary and and all. But the religion comes in two ways. One is, first of all, that again, the Africans had brought over what was largely, you might say, the overall description is called Shango, which is spelled multiple ways, but usually it's Shango. Um, and so that has certain, you might say, ceremonial aspects and rhythmic aspects that are brought in. But then you also had, because the French and the Spanish being a Latin culture, Roman Catholic, you had carnival, which is, corresponds, here in the U.S. to, Mardi Gras, shall we say, which also that's a Latin and French-based culture, as well as significant African influences there too. But so the music started being used. You might say, yes, it was in existence year round, but it was started. Its main use was for carnival processions and celebrations, and then we had in one more cultural and linguistic element, the British. The British end up taking over Trinidad and Tobago. I think it was 1797. But by no means have the French and the lesser example. I mean, less influences of the Spanish are still lingering. So Calypso continues, and this is now where we get a little bit of a socioeconomic discussion that. It wasn't just the planters, but as the place became a little bit more settled and developed, there was a growing middle class as well as excuse me, upper class of planters. But there were merchants and commercial interests in the towns, especially the capital, Port of Spain. Excuse me, and there were growing concerns that Carnival is turning into something pretty rowdy. Yeah, at nighttime there were torchlit processions, and the Haitian Revolution had taken place a while before, but by the 1880s the British are becoming extremely concerned about rowdiness and all. I mention this because there was an actual there were a number of ordinances that went down to basically suppress the more unrestrained celebration of Carnival by the they were no longer slaves, but by the Afro-Caribbean population, quote unquote lower classes. I mean, I just mentioned social class ties into this as well. And in any case, what this meant, and I am finally getting on to really the development of the music.
No, take your time. I appreciate you being elaborate on it.
Okay, thank you. Well, what this meant is that middle class organizers started coming in and saying, okay, we need to not only keep this under the control, shall we say, of us, so that we don't have potentially threatening masses of the black population celebrating at night with torches and who might possibly be revolutionary or something like that. But seriously, that. They started arranging what were called Calypso tents, and TENTS, which was literally at first it was a tent that was set up in a formal way for they might say they had what you would call social groups based around troops, TROUPE, troops of Calypso performers, and sometimes individual performers. They're like social groups, but they're also having rivalries, but they were organized rivalries. That's the big difference, is organized and limited. And then they had, more formally, they had contests as well, monetary awards sometimes as well. And so you might say that was the domestication of Calypso in the late 19th century. And this is also when the English language, of the Calypso songs being put into English language were starting to come in. Yes, English had been introduced, you might say, a century or more before, but the rural population especially was still using largely a French, Afro-French dialect largely. But in any case, English was considered, again, this is, the British authorities being in charge, but still was considered kind of a prestigious language to use for Calypso, and is a way to show off your oratorical skills, shall we say. And I mention this because one of the defining characteristics of Calypso, especially recorded Calypso, which we're going to get to in just a second, is especially some of the early stuff, but even nowadays with the party-oriented soca music, that there's great word play. it's not just puns, but there's sometimes 2 or 3 meanings at once, if you listen closely, and because of the surprisingly complicated, uh, ethnic and racial history of Trinidad and Tobago, because I have not even mentioned yet about, and I won't go into great detail, but, after the end of slavery, which was gradual in the 1830s, there's gradual emancipation, but understandably, former slaves did not want to work for sugar plantations, even for a wage. So the British authorities said, "Oh, we've got to import laborers from somewhere." So they signed up a lot of East Indian laborers and some Chinese laborers. So they get mixed into the social grouping as well.
Mhm.
And then, of course, you have, you know, um, shall we say, intermixture. So you had people who were of mixed background, and so you had all this going on. And then you had the religious influences, as mentioned. Carnival, yes, but Calypso is going to get detached from strictly a carnival music in just a little while. But but you did have, these various cultural and some religious influences. Oh, yes, I forgot to mention that Protestantism was starting to come in under the British, and there were, missionaries from starting in the late 19th century, on very much in the 20th century of Pentecostal and evangelical forms of Protestant Christianity as well. And that does tie in because some of the types of calypso that gets recorded is actually, first of all, some of it is Shango ceremonies with actual lyrics in what might be Yoruban language from Nigeria in particular.
Mhm.
Um, and there's still, they continued well into even the 1970s. They would occasionally have little catchphrases that are sung in French Creole. Sometimes it was, you might say, attempts at being kind of semi-naughty, that there might be something with sexual connotations, and so they say the French phrase or something like that. But anybody who's from Trinidad and Tobago or anybody who's taken high school French can figure it out. Any case, what was going on with Calypso in terms of recording? 1912 is you might say the genesis year of recording. That's um, and it was called Lovey's String Band. It was an instrumental, but it was a song called Mango Vert. Mango Vert means green fig or green mango. It was an instrumental version of a traditional calypso song. Um, so I should mention, starting the 1890s, there was a fairly significant immigration of Trinidadians. Where I'm looking at them right now, I'm not even talking about Jamaicans or Bahamians or others, but just Trinidadians starting to the United States for greater economic opportunity. Alas, as we know, racial segregation and stuff was very bad in those days. But that still, you had a significant immigration to primarily to New York City
Mhm.
and also to Miami. Those were the two big areas. Ultimately, you did get some going to other coastal locations, surprisingly far in the Northeast, Roxbury, Massachusetts. For instance, to this day, they have actually an annual carnival, West Indian Carnival in Roxbury. I'm originally from New Hampshire, and I was astounded to find this out. But a friend of mine, a fellow DJ on WNH, he and his wife took me there, and I said, "Wow, steel drums and everything in the Boston area? Yes." uh, but in addition to Miami, there's also Providence, Rhode Island has a significant West Indian, at least descended population, and then no surprise, New Orleans to some extent as well.
Mhm.
So, what's going on with Calypso? Why I mentioned this thing about recording, because this is now going to change a little bit about what Calypso is, because there's a growing commercial market. In the 1920s, American record companies started recording a few, not many, but a few West Indian artists who actually were also emigres, or at least part-year emigres. The big one was a guy named Sam Manning, um, and this and he's sort of like considered a little bit controversial in regards that some consider him. Some scholars consider him not truly a calypso singer, although he did, but he was more of a jazz and a vaudeville singer, even though his origins were not American. But in any case, so those are some of the earliest. Another guy named Phil Madison, who was, I think, from Guyana, British Guyana. But 1927 is the big year for recording and how calypso is really going to start developing. A guy named his real name was Frederick Kendricks, but he used the name Wilmoth Houdini, like Houdini the magician. That's
Oh
what he named
yeah,
himself.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that because I do want to mention that one interesting feature about calypso music throughout its history and still going on today is the adoption of a music name, a recording name, a Calypso name. Yes, there are some who kept their name throughout, like Harry Belafonte, for instance, uh, but uh, but there are others who adopted names, and so uh, Wilmuth Houdini, otherwise Frederick Wilmuth Kendricks. Um, he came to the United States, to New York in particular, in 1927, and started recording a recording career for Brunswick Records at first. And why I mention this is he's the first big time seller in the United States, especially, but also the records being imported back to Trinidad and Tobago primarily, but also interesting enough to places like South Africa and some of the West African countries that were at that point colonies of the British Empire. But he's the first quote unquote genuine Calypsonian really to have recorded. He had experience in Trinidad and Tobago in singing the calypso chants, singing extemporaneously, being able to improvise and all. And so Houdini is the one who really kicks off calypso in some ways as we know it nowadays. Yes, to our ears in 2021, it might sound a little antique, because it's got like almost Dixieland band jazz accompaniment, although melodically it's not really Dixieland at all. But it resembles it with use of banjos and clarinets and pianos and things.
Well, I just wanted to kind of not pause you here, but I want to kind of get a feel of what your take is on, because we learned here on the show, listening to a couple episodes on the blues. The blues were kind of getting their recording sessions done in the 20s. And then at that time, it was kind of called race records.
Yes,
race music or
correct.
whatever. So
That's
how
right.
then so you're saying that Calypso was imported, or it was recorded here as part of the commercialization of it? I mean,
Yeah,
can you mention? I mean, can you elaborate or expand on any of that?
Yeah. It was at some of the record companies. There weren't very many who were doing it. OKEH, Columbia, and a few others. They started this in actually the early 20s, after the scattering of things in the early 19 teens, and it was because they were not marketing it. In fact, it really wasn't until about 1920, as you likely very well know, that's when the major record companies started identifying an African American music market as such, with Mamie Smith and Crazy Blues being the surprise hit, shall we say. Suddenly, there's a market here. So yes, there had been, as you know, African American based recordings going back at least as far back as about 1890. Some vocal groups and some spiritual singing and all too. But so starting in 1920, really, you can pinpoint it that year. There's a growing realization and development of a black market, both to African Americans and by African American artists. Although sometimes there's a little confusion, sometimes about who really is being marketed to whom, but I could get into that some other time too. But where Calypso falls into this is that yes, it was not considered truly, except for maybe some of Manning's recordings, Sam Manning, as jazz or blues in any way, but there was by that point a relatively noticeable, significant immigrant population from the Caribbean in those coastal cities that I've mentioned, as well as a market back home, shall we say, in Trinidad and Tobago. And so the music was kind of marketed first, falling under very loosely the umbrella of South American or Latin American music. There are some connections to that, but it really is not truly anything at all like son and begin and things of that nature. Later on, salsas later it wasn't around in the 20s, but it was kind of a semi niche market. I mean, yes, African Americans who were interested in jazz and blues, not to mention the occasional white potential music consumer might have the record companies certainly wouldn't mind selling to them at all, but they were not the real targets. It was to the immigrant communities, Caribbean immigrant communities, and then marketing back home. You might say exporting the records. Things then you got a big takeoff in 1934, thanks to a very enterprising Trinidadian Portuguese background Trinidadian named Eduardo Sá Gomes, who had a series of radio repair shops and record stores. He got the idea, well, wait a minute, maybe I can take some more of these Calypsonians, as they're called, Calypso singers, and get them recorded and make some more records that I can sell in my shops, essentially.
Oh. Mhm.
So there were three of the major early singers. Again, I won't go. I'll try to avoid going into great details. I can go way off on tangents here. I get crazy about the music, but seriously, the Roaring Lion, Attila the Hun. They were two of the first, and I think Caresser, Lord Caresser was the other one. There were several other early singers too, but those are the main ones who started off. They were brought to New York to just record a limited number of songs that they had recently sung and performed at the carnival, which takes place typically around February, March, and so while they were rehearsing in the New York record studio, I think it was Decca Records, DECCA, Decca Records, that just by chance, then big time radio star Rudy Valley, Vallee, I think is how his name is spelled, Rudy Valley. He sang pop music and maybe a little bit of jazz, but primarily pop music. But he was a major radio and record star at that time. He overheard the singing and so at a break, he came in and he approached them and he asked what's going on. Well, in any case, he found out. He said, "I'd love to have you guys appear on my radio show." Well, they appeared on this radio show, which had very strong signal. I mean, it was probably what do you call it, networked. But in any case, it went through most of the United States, and it could be very faintly heard back down in Trinidad and Tobago as well. And this brought instant, shall we say, prestige because wow, big time USA has an interest in our music.
Mhm.
And of course, Eduardo Sagomez was thrilled because he could make bigger sales of records. So this became a tradition up through 1941. World War II, of course, having to interfere with recording activities. But in some ways, some scholars consider the 1930s, 34 to 41, particular, as the golden years. In some ways, that's kind of an exaggeration because there's plenty of good music that followed. But that's really a lot of the classics that are known as for nowadays, such as Matilda, Matilda, those kind of songs that they were laid down. And any case, so that developed, you might say, really brought fame to the music on a larger scale. Yes, it was, of course, again, the immigrant communities and some African Americans, but the white folk music, progressive folk music type group began, especially New York City, became interested in this. Oh, this is music of the people, of the Caribbean people. And so some progressive clubs, I say progressive because, in the time of racial segregation, yes, it's New York City, but they made a big deal that we are going to have an integrated audience. Everybody gets to sit together as well as listen to the musicians together. So a growing white audience, finally, popular audience began to tune into Calypso as well. World War II takes place. Unfortunately, recording activities pretty much, end. The U.S. is an ally of the British, and but they want to make a deal. Franklin Roosevelt wants to make a deal that okay. If we're willing to sell, a whole bunch of, battleships to the British, but we want to then have a naval base ourselves in Trinidad and Tobago. So there's the U.S. has a major naval base in Trinidad, 1942 through, actually it went after the war as well, but the big years were 42 through 47. And there are tens of thousands, several, maybe 30, 40,000 U.S. service members, mostly white, but also some African Americans there. They find out about Calypso music, and also the what do you call it? The American authorities were realizing, hey, we got to keep these sailors soldiers and sailors under some control because there was a lot of wild partying going on, shall we say?
Yeah.
And so one way to and yes, prostitution that features in a lot of Calypso lyrics, especially at that time. But long story short is. So American servicemen are encouraged to have their nighttime activity in approved clubs where they get to listen to the music, which they loved, actually, many of them. So this continues to develop the interest in the music, American interest in music, commercial interest in music. The war ends. Tourism also starts picking up too to the Caribbean, not just Trinidad and Tobago, but Jamaica and other places as well. So I mention this because now you've got, in addition to the immigrant community, in addition to relatively limited, but still some African American community of music lovers out there, you've got a significantly growing now white American, and also not to mention British and some other Europeans, who are starting to take vacations and cruises and stuff much more than they ever did before. And so I mention this because not only is the music much more popularized and commercialized, but also to the dismay of some purists, shall we say, whether they're folklorists or they're people from Trinidad and Tobago, who say the focus of the music should strictly be either around carnival or should be just addressing social and political issues only. The music starts going off onto a much more commercial vein, you might say, to cultivate commercial, non-Trinidadian, non-West Indian interests in some ways. Some of it's rather amusing. I mean, they had always had some surprisingly bold sexual lyrics, even back in the 30s and 20s. But now there's a lot of stuff about mistaken identities and about white babies being produced and I mean, and this is more than one. I mean, there's easily 5 or 10 songs of that nature, uh,
Mhm.
uh, and escapades and cheating and all that. So. The so it's a mixed bag. The music is much more commercialized and sells very well, but understandably, whether you're an outsider who thought this was an uncontaminated folk music that's now been contaminated, or whether you are somebody who grew up in Trinidad and saying, "My music is becoming diluted and is going off on these tangents." Well, that didn't last too long because luckily, the original impulses of social and political commentary had not at all gone away. And so in the mid 50s, there was something called the Young Brigade that was established. And this was some of the young, some of them weren't super young, but some of them were quite young, beginning of their 20s. In particular, there's the Mighty Sparrow, who's still around today and still recording. He's had a period of sickness and illness, but he seems to be making a comeback in his mid 80s. uh,
Wow.
yeah, the Mighty Sparrow and Lord Kitchener sounds like a British official of World War I. Yes, but his real name was Aldwyn Roberts, he's died. He died now, but they were two of the more prominent ones. But there were others who, in the mid to late 50s, started reintroducing, shall we say, more serious themes. Yes, they did continue to record some sexual themes and amusing calypsos as well. So that's kind of the development of you might say classic calypso. But the 1960s come along, and the music does change a bit. There are outside influences that are beginning to be felt. American, for instance, soul music to some extent. The style hasn't changed that much yet, but the 70s. That's where things really change big. That's where soca comes in.
Mm.
Long story short, it was about 74, 75. Several, artists with kind of funny names, but Crazy was the name of one of them. And then Arrow, not Sparrow, but Arrow. He, of course, knew what he was doing when he took on the name Arrow, that he would be confused with the Mighty Sparrow.
Mhm.
He was not from Trinidad. He was from the much smaller island of Montserrat. But in any case, they started significantly changing the music, making it much more dance-oriented. And also, once again, you might say this is making the music in terms of lyrics, at least, some of it a little less serious, more party oriented. A lot of it was about shake, shake, shake.
Mhm.
Which is I'm not a prude. I don't mind at all. But for those who are a little bit more of a spiritual or intellectual bent, that could be dismaying. However, even though the music, since the mid 70s really has almost entirely soca has almost entirely taken the place of traditional calypso, you will find occasionally some serious, definitely very serious lyrics going on in modern soca music, modern form of calypso as well. So, believe it or not, even though I've rambled and rambled, that actually is a compressed version of my take on what is, calypso as a genre. Yeah.
Oh, no, I appreciate that. That was very detailed historically. I mean, chronologically, I should say. Yeah, I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Yeah.
Sure.
So, having all of that knowledge in your headspace, what made you? How did you get to the point where you decided to put it into a book format?
Well, okay, yes, indeed. That's a change from just being a fan or an enthusiast, although I continue to be that very much. But okay, yeah, I as I mentioned, it was about 1970, so that's literally now over 50 years ago, slightly. I was 13 at the time. I started collecting records. And my first were early rock and roll rhythm and blues of the 50s. Fats Domino, Chuck Berry were my first, records that I remember buying. But I haven't, of course, stopped since. And over the years, as I mentioned, I think a little bit earlier when I talked about my interest in Calypso, I've of course been purchasing Calypso records and nowadays primarily CDs. I don't get into streaming music or anything at all. I'm still a tangible music guy. But in any case, uh, have developed I think a better than average knowledge of some of this music. At least somebody of my background and age, and so and I keep on hosting radio shows. I am currently I'm hosting, as you had mentioned, the Golden Oldies radio show. I've been doing it continuously since this particular show since May, so that's almost exactly 23 years ago, May 1998. And
Mm.
so why I mention this is because you know I listen to the music a lot, not just to broadcast on the show. And at one point, I can't remember exactly when it was, but at one point, I said to myself, this sounds a lot like Calypso. I mean, some of it. Sometimes there were direct remakes of West Indian calypsos by African American artists. Not to mention actually white pop and some, believe it or not, even country artists. Did some not bad versions actually of adaptations of calypso music. Uh, but still, the focus of most of my music is R&B, of the 40s through early 60s, and so I had published my first music history book in 2013. That was Arizona Drains, the School of Arizona Drains Gospel Music Pioneer. I had published way back in the mid 90s a couple of history books that have nothing to do with music history, but music history publishing was starting in 2013. I started actually in 2010, but published in 2013. And so, the next year after that, I was saying, well, it's hard work publishing a book, because this music book, the Drains book in particular, I'll mention right now, and now the Rhythm and Blues Goes Calypso book. These are scholarly books. Yes, they are music books by an enthusiast, but I heavily footnote them. I do have a PhD in history, and these books are intended not to be breathtakingly boring and legalistic, footnoting absolutely everything. But I do follow serious scholarly conventions, and so I do have literally like 400 or 500 footnotes, for each of these books,
Mhm.
and because while I sometimes cautiously may speculate on something, I am very cautious about that because you know I do want to make sure that the scholarly audience, whether it is possibly some college students who might be using these in some sort of a music class, or just other academics who may be out there, that they can see that Tim Dodge is not just rambling in an enthusiastic way; he's actually backing up what he has to say. So,
Sure. So
so any
were there
case,
interviews a part of that process?
excuse me,
Were there
excuse me.
interviews a part of that
Oh,
process?
no, no, no. I had hoped, again, for back to the Arizona Drains book. I mean, she died back in 1963. She was born 1889, and her recording activities were way back in the 20s. But I'd hoped to, interview maybe some of her. She didn't have children, but I'd hoped to some family members, descendants, because she had several siblings, and a couple of them had rather unusual first names. She was from Texas, despite her first name of being Arizona. But and so thanks to the internet, this would not have been really very feasible in the pre-internet days. I searched around and I found names and phone numbers of about 5 or 6 people who seemed to be possible descendants of her siblings. And I know I'm appearing out of nowhere, so who am I? But I explained very briefly in a letter, and I closed my business card, and I said, I understand that you should feel totally free, to answer or not answer if you wish, but this is what I'm doing, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, and I also recognizing that if any of these people might be elderly, for instance, even if they're, let's say grandchildren or something like that, they might have still been born in the 1920s or 30s or something. So grandchildren of siblings, not of Drains herself. So I recognize they might not have email or whatever. So I gave them the option of telephone or letter, or email, whatever they wanted. I only heard back actually from one who was kind enough, but they said, "Sorry, we're not related." So you may be aware, if you're into gospel music, that oh, what was his first name? This is awful, but AK Couch was his last name.
Oh, Andre.
Andre, I'm sorry. Yes, I should have known. He died recently, but in any case, he was the son of the Bishop Couch in Texas, who really got the Church of God in Christ denomination really going big in Texas, and then he moved to California, and that's his son. And so, in any case, I was aware that at some point. The elder Couch had some connection with Arizona Drains that I think she had performed in some of revivals, if nothing else, in his church. So I was curious. I wondered if, going by the death dates and birth dates and stuff, I knew that Andre Crouch, I think he was born in 1942, if I remember right. That he had been as young, a kid, and maybe even a teenager when Arizona Drains might have appeared in his father's church. And so I it was hard to find contact information. It was ultimately it was just an online form, that you filled out. I mean, as you know, the guy was a major, not just preacher, but recording artist. And so I explained very briefly. I said, I understand you're a busy man and you don't know me, etc. But if you could just, even if it's just a very, very brief sentence or two, if you could just give me some, memories you might have of Arizona Drains. What was she like in person? What was her music like? Sadly, I didn't get a peep back. I was hoping maybe even some, office worker, because he's probably he was that large,
Right.
but they probably get unsolicited stuff like that all the time. So they probably said, some academic, no, this is, he's too busy. We're going to not even bother him. So, but for the Calypso book, no, I did not interview anybody either. No, but I relied obviously on literally hundreds of recordings. But then I also went through lots of newspaper articles some of them did have interviews and magazine articles, some of them scholarly, some of them popular magazine articles, and not to say a few books. There are not all that many books, scholarly books that are out there really about Calypso. In fact, I might say that the massive big one, classic, which is now a little on the older side, I think it came out in 1990, is by a guy named Gordon Roller. It's a German name, but he's actually an Afro-Caribbean who lives in Trinidad. And it's like a 600 plus page book. Fascinating book, but that's the only truly scholarly work. Well, there's also a few others. There's Donald Hill and a couple of others, but still, that's the gold mine as far as I'm concerned for providing me with a lot of leads that I tracked down in terms of finding more detailed information by newspaper article, magazine article. I mean, you didn't have that much in Billboard, but some of them were music trade journals, things of that nature. So that's kind of what happened, shall we say?
Okay. Yeah. So how was the pitch to your publisher? I mean,
Oh yes, of course, yes. So Lexington Books is with whom I'd published before, and I figured I might as well go with them again. And so you can sometimes submit an entire manuscript, but I would rather first find out if there's some real interest there before I
right.
embark on
Yeah.
3 to 5 years of labor.
Right.
So what I did was but they do have as a minimum, you have to submit a completed chapter, one truly complete chapter, and then also a detailed outline or prospectus, as well as you might say, an updated resume and things of that nature. So I did that, and of course, by that point, I had a small, but I did have a track record with them, one published book. And I was pleased to see that, they were interested. And so that's, with the go ahead, I said, okay, I'm going to crank away at this. And I did.
Yeah.
And that book was published March of last year, 2019, or the year before last. Whoops, we're already in 2021. But in any case, almost about 2 years ago. So,
yeah. So you mentioned soca, but I mean, I don't know if you have time to talk about it, but you kind of mentioned it's the evolution of Calypso today.
Yes, right. That's correct.
Yeah.
I mean, it's they largely use synthesizers and heavily percussive backgrounds, which are great for dancing. But melodically, I think soca is not even as good as it was when it started out. Even in the '80s, when I was hearing on the radio show in Miami, a lot of it had horns, real horns backing up the singers. You would have very catchy percussion, then you'd have the singing, and then you'd have a blast of horns, like a riff, keep going, and it was wonderful. But by the 1990s, the horns have largely disappeared, and synthesizers can sound good, but I don't think they're as good.
Right. So, is there a huge global festival for Calypso music?
Well, they do have these. I think they have names like Cari Fest, the Carib Fest, in particular. Yeah, in addition to Carnival itself, which is still a significant cultural force in Trinidad and Tobago in particular, but they also do have some international ones that take place. Miami has actually had more than one. Where people come in from outside the U.S. to perform, and also Toronto in Canada.
Yeah.
Interestingly enough, and not to mention actually London or near London, because they also have a significant West Indian population, or at least descended from West Indians, still big there too. And of course, as I'm sure you know, that probably in some ways a much more recognizable to the average American population form of West Indian popular music really is reggae. That's a lot more popular in some ways, and it's a wonderful music, and it has some distant but very distant connections to calypso. It's not really a form of calypso at all, but so there are definitely reggae festivals and things, but you are not likely to hear much soca at those, and vice versa. You might hear a little bit of reggae. In fact, it's interesting enough interesting as is true of a lot of other forms of popular music, that sometimes reggae soca, excuse me, has adapted, sometimes has brought in a little bit of reggae format to some of their music as well. They've also brought in every now and then a little bit of rap nowadays too. Um, and of course, you might say, well, who came up with rap first? Because sometimes some people say, well, actually, Jamaican rappers living in Harlem came up with rap to a degree first. Well, not necessarily. You go back much further, 20s. There are some really great jazz, blues, and even gospel artists, and even country artists, some who have a very rhythmic way with music in the background as early as the late 20s. You have some that it wasn't obviously called rap, and there are some differences, I understand, not just because of musical background, but music that you hear in the background, music technology. I mean, also, what's the purpose of a rap lyric, etc., things like that. But seriously, why I've digressed a little bit on that is just to say that you will have, yes, international settings, and sometimes you will have other genres that are brought in. Sometimes you might say to spice it up or to have a little bit of variety.
Right. Right. Yeah. So, I asked you to introduce someone who's not familiar with the calypso genre to give us your recommendation as far as an introduction to the sound. Are you ready?
I am.
All right, lay it
It's
on
hard.
us.
It's hard to limit these, but I have, you might say, a top five and then another top five, but that's it. I could have like a top 500 really, but what I try to do is have a fairly wide time frame. I don't bring it up into the 21st century, but I do bring it into the soca era a little bit, and I am leaving off an awful lot, but it's a combination of some of these are truly representative, and some of them are actually quite well known, but a couple of them are a little on the obscure side, but they are so suitable, in my opinion, for the sound and introductions to what the music is about, that I had to mention them. So let's start very briefly with that first one I mentioned, Mango Vert, the instrumental by Lovey's Trinidad String Band, recorded for Columbia in 1912, mainly because it is the first documented example of calypso on record. There are vocal versions of it, but not the first one that was recorded was just the instrumental version. Okay, I'm going to mention now this one in some ways, again, some folklore purists might disagree about to include this one, but I think just because it's so landmark. Harry Belafonte's Banana Boat song, Deo, recorded in late 1955 on RCA Victor Records, big hit in 1956. I say this because he himself was interesting. Yes, he does have a kind of a Jamaican accent, but he was, technically speaking, he was always American because he was born in New York. But he spent a good part of he went back and forth to Jamaica. So he essentially culturally, in many ways, is actually Jamaican, although he is actually technically speaking African American too. That this song is you might say really helped create a craze or a love, a fascination with calypso music among the general American population. And that's, as I mentioned very early on with our interview today, even almost 10 years later, 1964, 65, a little elementary kid in school, we were singing Deo. And
Right.
I'm sure that was prompted by, Belafonte's success. Just very quickly, I will mention that he didn't or- uh, originate the song. The lyrics were largely written by a guy named Lord Burgess, but even he didn't come up with it first. It's really an adaptation of a traditional Jamaican work song, and the first actually recorded version was by a Trinidadian guy named Edric Connor, living in Britain in 1954. And it's rather different. Very briefly, I'll just mention that Edric Connor, if you're familiar at all with Paul Robeson, uh,
Yes.
well, that that you know serious stentorian, but very resonant and rich vocal approach. Connor uses that same approach that Robeson had used as well.
Mhm.
So, Banana Boat song. Moving way up now to the 1960s briefly, I'm going to jump back and forth a little bit in terms of time, but I do think this next one is an important song recording, both because it's really good, but also because of what it stands for. And here it is. Here's what it is. Calypso Rose. Her name was Macartha, Mccartha Lewis, but Calypso Rose. She's still alive today, although in her 80s. She is the first significant female calypso artist. There were others before her, going back to as far as 1937. There was somebody named Lady Ayiri, which was the native name for Trinidad, Lady Trinidad, Thelma Lane, but she wasn't a big success. Between Lady Ayiri in the late 30s and Calypso Rose in the mid 60s, there were just a tiny handful of women who recorded calypso. Very few. It continues to be in many ways a male dominated genre, but since the 1970s onwards, there have been a significant number of women artists as well. But Calypso Rose, 1966, on the National Record, that's the label name, National Record label, had her first big hit called Fire in Me Wire. um, this was a very popular. It's sort of an erotic song, but
Okay.
it's a really good one, and she really deserved to have won what was called the Calypso Monarch title that Trinidad awards during their carnival, but it wasn't. She got her first award about 11 years later, 1977, for something called "Give Me Tempo" or "More Tempo," but I just mentioned that Calypso Rose, was really the pioneer of women in calypso, and she has an awful lot of other good ones too. But Fire Me Wire, her first big one. Now let's go back 10 years earlier to 1956. The Mighty Sparrow. His real name was Great Slinger Francisco, but he took on a show name, the Mighty Sparrow, on Kay Records. He recorded a song that was a big hit in their carnival called Gene and Dinah. And I mentioned this as being significant because it wasn't his first recording. He'd recorded as early as 1954, but his first big hit recording, because this is what set him on the path to great fame, as in some ways he's referred to seriously by at least Trinidadians as the world's greatest calypso singer, the Calypso Monarch. He won that title over and over again in the 50s and 60s, on into the 70s and even into the 80s. And the song, it's as most of these are. It's very catchy. I can play my own little version of it on the piano. I like it so much, I figured it out. But it's very catchy. And at first you say to yourself, okay, this song seems to be about prostitution. Yes, it is about prostitute, one named Jean, one named Dinah. But listening more closely to the lyrics, what it ties into is the departure of the Yankees, the Americans from the military base. And he was by no means the only Calypsonian to have addressed the issue of, shall we say, Yankee monopolization of Trinidadian women because they've got more money.
Hmm.
And also maybe the uniform doesn't hurt either, but women like uniforms as well as money. I'm generalizing, but still,
Right.
there's some truth to that. But if you listen to Sparrow's lyrics, there's humor, but there's also some real grievance and frustration expressed there about, thou shalt no more hotels to lay down your head. Thou shalt now work with sweat from thy head, and no more Yankees to spoil the party. You know, Dorothy have to take what she get. So
Yeah.
yeah, so it's a song of revenge, basically.
Yeah, yeah.
But also you might say assertion of the Trinidadian man. These Yankee soldiers, most of whom are white, they're gone. Now we've got our women back, and they are under our control. And speaking about women, again, this is going to be a little on the sexist side, but this is truly a landmark one. This next one going to go back to 1934 by the Roaring Lion. His real name was Hubert Raphael Charles de Leon, but otherwise the Roaring Lion. He was one of those who went in the 1930s to record it and was on American radio. Major artist is called Marry an Ugly Woman, and you might say, well, that what's going on? He says, you take my advice, never, don't marry, always marry a woman uglier than you, because his claim is that if she's pretty and nice, she's going to cheat. She's not reliable.
Mhm.
Well, I mentioned this because not only was that song done over and over again by many other artists, but this is where it ties in with my that recent book about rhythm and blues goes Calypso. Jimmy Soul was his name, an African-American artist on the Legrand Records in 1962, recorded If You Want to Be Happy, which was a big hit in 1963 on radio. And it wasn't, just on, you might say, a soul or R&B station. It was pop American rock and roll radio. And he used that song. He changed it into rock and roll, but he largely kept the same lyrics and the same melody. So that's another landmark Calypso, in my opinion, to be aware about. The original version, I forgot to mention, by Roaring Lion, Marry an Ugly Woman, that was recorded in the Columbia record label. Okay, just a few more, because I couldn't resist. I had to have 5 more that I really thought maybe I can include a few more.
No, not at all. Go ahead.
Let's move on into the soca era, at least briefly, and in a particular adaptation of Calypso, because I'd mentioned earlier about the fairly complicated racial and ethnic background of the society of Trinidad and Calypso. Indians, there is now a genre. There has been a genre now for over 30 years of what's called chutney soca. That means East Indian type soca. It's heavily influenced by the East Indian population there. I should very briefly mention that even though of course the contract labor system with the plantations and stuff ended in 1917, a long time ago. By now, the Indian population and the Afro Trinidadian population have had some sort of a sense of rivalry and dispute occasionally. They some ways they feel threatened by each other for different reasons, but largely economic. And so the rise of chutney soca, has been a little controversial, at least among Afro Trinidadians. But the music is so good. I've heard a fair amount of it because it's recognizable as soca, but it includes the use of the sitar, for instance. And sometimes. Occasionally, some of the verses may be even sung in Hindi or one of the other Indian languages,
Wow.
occasionally. And sometimes they also use this special drum called tassa, T-A-S-S-A, the tassa drum. I mention this because the first big hit in that genre came out in 1988, pretty recent as far as I'm concerned. I know some younger listeners may say that's a long time ago, but seriously, 1988 is not that long ago considering the history of Calypso music. And the label is called Red Disco, R-E-D-I-S-C-O. The artist is called Drupati, a woman, Drupati Ramgunai, and it's called Mr. Bisesar. She sings about, I think he's a made-up character, but in any case, he leads a tassa drum session, and it's a very, very catchy song. And this was a big, big hit in 1988 into 89. And this is if it wasn't the very first chutney calypso, it was definitely the first chutney calypso hit. And since then, there have been a few others. Ramgunai herself, I think she may still be recording, as far as I know. Also from the soca era, and this is somebody who is not Trinidadian. He was Jamaican, but he specialized in his last several decades. He died now, and you'll find out who he is in just a second. In soca music, but he started out actually recording some mento, which is mento, which is the Jamaican form of calypso, and then he'd gotten very heavily into ska. He didn't get much into reggae, which, interesting enough, which reggae in large ways derived out of ska. But in any case, Byron Lee. And the Dragonaires. That's his instrumental group. And in 1984, on the Dynamic Sounds record label, this was a huge hit. I remember in Miami. I mean, you could not escape it, and I'm glad I loved it. It's called Tiny Whiny. Tiny Whiny. Long story short, it's about a girl says, is chick from country come down to wail down the town. She's a shall we say a well-shaped woman who likes to swivel her hips is what it is. But it's even though you might say some more prudish type listeners, might think, "Oh, what a theme for a song!" And the record cover is a very, very revealing photo, shall we say? I'm a healthy now older man, but I was a young man then, healthy young man. The cover is not what sold me, but it didn't hurt.
Right.
but but seriously, it's such a good natured song and such a fun song, really just about dancing, having a good time that you can't help but say and smile, say, I don't care really what might have inspired this song. This is such a danceable, fun song. And also, my first trip to the Caribbean was in 1986. I went to the Bahamas, and even though Bahamian music tends to be a bit different, but they do have their own version of calypso called Goombay. And in the hotel where I was staying, they had, of course, a little band one evening, and one of the songs they played was Tiny Whiny. I knew it right away. I said, "Oh, great! This is not Bahamian music, strictly speaking, but this is great." So, Tiny Whiny, I do think seriously is a landmark form of soca, the modern form of calypso that people ought to know about. I'll be pretty quick here. Just two or three more numbers to recommend. I'd referred earlier on to Wilmeth Houdini as a significant person in the history of calypso music, especially recorded calypso music. He recorded literally like 150 or so great records from the 20s through the early 50s. Interesting enough, he was an interesting guy that in an interview for the New Yorker magazine, 1946, he was a great self-promoter. He claimed to have recorded over 800 records. No, I've consulted discographies and stuff, but still about 150 is still a pretty signight number. These are
I was thinking it was, yeah.
Especially in those days, also where recording in some ways was a little bit you had more primitive equipment than nowadays, etc. So not that easy to do. Just one out of his many, many wonderful recordings is one called Arima Tonight, Sangre Grande Tomorrow Night. Those are names of two towns. I've been in Arima myself. I've been in Trinidad back in the mid-'90s. I took a trip there. It was fascinating, wonderful. It was on the Brunswick record label in 1931. But what the song is, it's a celebration of the music about traveling from town to town, having what he called, the term was it's a déliceau, which is another term for having a delicious occasion, a party, essentially. And the musical accompaniment is also absolutely outstanding. The instrumentation, as I said, kind of reminds me a little bit of Dixieland jazz. There's a cornet that sounds almost like Louis Armstrong, although it's not Armstrong. And there's some very vigorously strummed banjo. There's clarinet. There's piano, and yes, there's some percussion as well. And it is so exciting and fun. Just one quick example of the many, many recordings that I think people might want to listen to by Wilmeth Houdini. Okay, two more here, and then I will have to end my recommendations, even though I could go on and on. This next one is, you might say, I'm really going far afield in one regard, that this is a white pop group, but here's why. The Andrews Sisters, famous for Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy and others in the 30s and 40s and early 50s. They were great singers, but they were by no means calypso singers. They were, however, this was, I think, their biggest hit, and if not their biggest hit, this is considered the biggest calypso hit of all time. Their version of Rum and Coca-Cola. Rum and Coca-Cola. It has an interesting story behind it because they did not originate it and they did not get involved. They were not the ones who were sued, but there was a huge lawsuit that arose out of the song. There was a they recorded for Decca Records in 1944. The record was released in early 1945, and it became a big, big hit. And African Americans also bought it too. I've looked at the chart listings and all. Interesting enough, there were very, very few African Americans who recorded this song. Not until even much later. Interestingly enough, I'm really kind of surprised, but that's the case. There, one of the later versions actually was by a Trinidadian himself. His real name was Daniel Brown, but he used the name Trinidad Rio in 1990. He slightly changed the lyrics, but it's the same song and with a soca approach. But in any case, the Andrews Sisters recording was a massive, massive success. And here's why it was controversial, though, was because very quickly a lawsuit got going because a compiler of Calypsos had noticed this first, and he found out that the man who really wrote the song, he didn't write the melody. It was kind of a semi-traditional melody going back to the 1890s, a carnival melody. But the lyrics were definitely by a man named Lord Invader. His real name is Rupert Grant, but he used Lord Invader as his Calypso name. He had recorded it and was performing it in clubs in Port of Spain. While the American servicemen were there, they picked up on it and they loved it. Well, visiting American comedian named Maury Amsterdam, was there, USO, shows, to build up morale. And so in any case, he somehow heard it and he transcribed it or wrote it and brought it back. Long story short, Amsterdam claimed, author's credits, and it was sold to a publisher named Leo Feist, Feist, Leo Feist. And in any case, when this was discovered, Invader, understandably, felt a bit outraged. Well, wait a minute, this is turning into a massive seller. I'm not making a penny. And in fact, I have a recording where he's interviewed briefly, and he says, "And I have not made one red cent." And I don't blame him. I don't blame him. Because if you're making your living, especially by Calypso, it matters.
Right.
Aside from any recognition and cultural appropriation or not, all these other things. So, long story short, Invader had an attorney to help him, more than one, but one major one. I think Nizer, Nizer was his last name, an American attorney, and the suit went on for years and years and years, but it finally was settled in favor of Lord Invader, Rupert Grant. It still took another several years. It was like 1955, about 10 years later, before he actually got his financial award, which was significant, but not massive, $10,000 approximately. But sure, with inflation, that's maybe $150,000, $200,000 in today's money, which is real money. But considering that the record by 2014 was the latest account I saw, has sold 7 million copies, the Andrews Sisters version only. I'm not even talking about other versions. Lord Invader really didn't make much off of his own composition. Sadly, he died in 1961. I think it was some illness at a relatively young age of 47. So he didn't really get the full recognition in some ways that he should have. But Rum and Coca-Cola, yes, it is a white pop group remake, but it is really, really good, aside from the fact that it's significant in terms of sales and influence. Finally, the last one I'll mention, that I'd mentioned earlier that Trinidad and Tobago largely, I think, is accurately known as the home of Calypso music. But, for instance, the Jamaicans with Mento, they like to think that they might have come up with it. Bahamians with Goombay might think the same. And then there's also in Belize, there's what used to be British Honduras. There's Bruck Dun, which is breakdown music. And there are other parts of the English-speaking Caribbean that may or may not claim the origins, but they certainly have had a long-term interest in Calypso music. Well, let's go to the Bahamas. There's a lot of significant, wonderful music there. It's also a place I've been to, and it's also where my wife comes from too. So there's another tie I certainly have. But so yeah, I've got Bahamian in-laws and stuff. I mean, her parents unfortunately are dead, but cousins and stuff and siblings that are still around. So. Significant singer there, Blind Blake. You might say, wasn't there a Blind Blake in the United States? Yes, there was in the 20s and early 30s, a great blues singer and guitarist and singer. But I'm talking about the Bahamian Blind Blake. His name was Blake Higgs, and he recorded some wonderful Bahamian Goombays. Some of them were actually remakes of well-known Trinidadian songs. But what is fascinating are his either self-composed or at least Bahamian-derived songs that he recorded in the 50s and 60s. And in one in particular, I want to bring to people's attention and strongly recommend that they hear. You can hear this, by the way. You can get it on YouTube for free if you can't locate a copy of the record or CD. I happen to have an original piece of wax from 1951,
Wow.
the ART record label. I don't normally that much go on my way to get originals. I'm more after the sound, but I do have a fair number of very old pieces of wax in my collection. But in any case, seriously, it's called "Run, Come See Jerusalem." You might say that sounds almost like something to do with gospel. Well, you might call it a little bit of a gospel song, but it's not really. It's him with his wonderful. He could play banjo and several other stringed instruments, but I think it's banjo that he primarily accompanies himself, and he has some other people accompanying him too, vocally too. They chime in. It's like call and response, and it's a fascinating account of a 1929 hurricane where there were 3 ships that were sailing from one island to another in the Bahamas. They were sunk and 29 people died. And the lyric refers to at the end, he says that the captain, George Brown, says, run, come see, witness your children, witness your judgment. They're all drowning. Run, come see Jerusalem. It is a fantastic kind of grim story. And yet at the same time, the music is so catchy, so wonderful. So I recommend that as one of my, shall we say, Calypso second top 5s.
So do you have any upcoming activities, and are you on social media?
I'm sorry, I'm kind of old-fashioned. I'm not on social media. But yeah, musical activities, I've got plenty of those. I have my weekly radio show on WEGL Auburn. It's currently on Thursday nights. This Thursday I'll be on from 6 to 8 p.m. Central Time. I do have an extended summer version starting next week. It's a 3-hour show, 6 to 9. While the focus really is 50s R&B, rhythm and blues, and doo-wop and stuff, I do throw on now and then a little bit of calypso, and I also will throw on a little bit of early 60s ska and Jamaican R&B, as well as, of course, gospel and, yes, country and blues, all of that, but, rock and roll, rhythm and blues.
Yeah.
And I do have now a new book contract with Lexington Books. I'm just at the very early stages. I've only got one completed chapter out of 6, so it's going to be a hard slog, but I'm looking forward to it. For my next book, I hope with them, it's called African American Covers of Country Music Before Ray Charles.
Wow. Okay. Yeah,
it's not a takedown of Ray Charles at all, because the chapter I submitted was the achievement of Ray Charles, is what I called that chapter that I sent in. But there were plenty of African Americans, at least 30 years, if not more, before Charles, who were recording their own versions of music that had first been recorded by white country artists. And in any case, I don't want to give it all away now because I haven't written the thing yet.
Yeah. Anybody who is unfamiliar with the genre should be able to pick up where you left off here and dive in and expand even further. And the historical perspective that you provided at the beginning of the show, that was so detailed. And I appreciate you doing it, taking the time and sharing all of that. Especially nuts and the tidbits in between all of that. That was fantastic. So thank you for making this a fantastic show.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Okay, I am so excited that I'm taking this musical journey. I have to tell you, being the host of this podcast, I have the benefit of sitting in those conversations, editing the recordings, and listening to the finished product. The plus side to all of that is that I get to be in sponge mode, where I get to soak it all in. I want to thank Dr. Timothy Dodge for sharing the history of Calypso and his passion for the music. I hope you enjoyed the episode like I did. This episode was very insightful for me as someone who is only familiar with the many sounds of the Caribbean on the surface. I'm definitely going to dive in, and I'm sure I will be adding a few Calypso artists to my playlist. Please be sure to share this episode and your favorite episode with someone who wants to expand their playlist. They can listen directly from our website, meetthemusic.buzzsprout.com, or wherever they get their podcasts. If this was your first episode, be sure to listen to our most downloaded episode of Zydeco with Michael Tessran, or listen to Motown Sound with Adam White. Thank you so much for joining us on our musical journey. Remember, if it's Monday, it's Meet the Music.